Good morning all and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion. As we follow on our topic of managers, this week we're addressing the weakest link. How to identify and support, because it is about supporting managers who are potentially not making the grade. Again, I've spent an awful lot of time looking at some of our stats and some of the things that sort of people talk about management with. So according to Level 11, who worked alongside the Ohio University looking at sales manager performance. And this is a real interesting view on sales managers. 32% of sales managers spend their time on managing people.
What's a sales manager?
Sales manager. It's been a long day.
Slow manager.
The spring is here.
A very slow manager, isn't it?
26% of sales managers' time is spent in managing information. 23% of sales managers' time is spent on customer interaction, and only 15% of sales managers' time is spent on administrative tasks. And this is where the stats got really sort of interesting when we start to combine them. So 25% of the bottom managers were performing at 76% of their target. The middle tier, the middle 50% of sales managers were performing at 99% of their target, and 25% of the top sales managers were performing at 115% of their target. However, a good sales manager will substantially outperform a poor one, but when we look heavily at the stats, the average and the below average sales manager have a very different view. And this is why. The bottom sales manager, who were hitting 76% of their target, only 47% of their staff were achieving their target. The middle managers, although they were achieving 99% of their target, only 48% of their staff were achieving their target. And the top sales managers, again, even though they were hitting 115%, only 65% of their staff were achieving their quota. So it says that middle 50% of sales managers are more than likely hitting their target, but only 48% of their target team are actually hitting their target, which is 1% above the bottom managers. So the dilemma is this: when we start to look at it from an anecdotal point of view, lots of sales managers get their quota not because of their sales staff, but because they are billing it themselves, or they have one or two salespeople that are absolutely knocking it out of the park, and then their own sales are adding to that. So according to HubSpot, 61% of managers or overperforming managers use their CRM to automate parts of the sale versus 46% of underperforming managers. According to LinkedIn, 60% of sales leaders anticipate their team won't be able to hit quota. Per research conducted by the Brooks Group, only 31% of sales managers had a strong confidence in their sales team ability, and 22% of sales managers spent less than 30 minutes individually coaching each direct report each week. They spent most of their time associated with the lower quoted people. So it tells us that the manager's job is really hard and they're under pressure. But the question is, how do we help the managers that are under pressure who aren't particularly performing? Because some of their performing might be masked, as we've found, by their own performance. So this week I've got Paul and Dave. Heather is out on client site somewhere. So let's kick in straight away, guys, and look at this from a point of view. So when we talk about managing performance with managers, what do we measure our managers on?
Well, it's an interesting question, because the obvious answer would be, for most recruitment business owners, measure them on their sales performance, or as you said, their snails performance. So I think that would be the obvious answer. Their performance, if they're billing managers, the performance of their team. But I would think that it's somewhat deeper than that. I think when we look at managers, and I think the word manager in itself is probably the wrong statement. I think when you're looking at leaders, what you're looking for are exactly what the term denotes: leadership skills. You're looking to understand how they're leading their people. And there are, I think, a number of things that are very difficult to measure, but you can definitely gauge them, particularly now you're in the office. And that is morale. You can see visibly, you can hear audibly what morale is like with the team. Are people happy? Are they energized? Are they aware of the vision of that particular area of the business and the overall business itself? Have they bought into hearts and minds what the business is trying to achieve and what their leader is trying to achieve? Can you see it? And can you see it in the performance reviews, from their comments, from their conversations with you as the owner? Is it evident that people are bought into their leader, that they're very much following and taking instruction, if you like, as I said, heart and mind from the person that they're following? And I think there are some difficult things in terms of what you put down in writing, but I think they're very evident when you see it in people. One of the things that I think is very important, we'll talk about it I'm sure later, is that it doesn't follow at all that the leader should be the highest biller in the team. And in fact, in many instances, shouldn't be billing at all. It's very much about the performance of the individuals that work for or work with that individual and the unit as a whole. I think a lot of billing managers find that particular concept a difficult one to transition into, on the premise that ultimately people around them should be invoicing more than they. And obviously, once you get beyond 5 people and above, it becomes extremely difficult, I think, to be able to bill at the same level that you might have billed at when you were on your own or you had just a few people around you. So just for starters, I'll let Dave pop in now, but just for starters, those would be the things I'd be looking for. I'd be looking for leadership qualities.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul's covered quite a lot of the points there. I think the key thing is I'm going to make an assumption that if you are managing your manager, that you will have spent some time with him or her and asked them the question, where is it that you think your performance could be better? Where do you think you could improve? And it could be about their style, to Paul's point, it could be about motivation, it could be about sales performance. But whatever it is, if you've had that conversation, the output of that should be 4 or 5 things that the manager then should be measured on. And the difference that I would make with an underperforming manager or a manager that isn't making the grade is that I would be measuring them much more tightly than I would somebody that is making the grade. So that could be every 3 or 4 days, it could be every week, it could be quicker or faster on certain aspects. Because as a leader, your desire would be to get that manager back up to speed as fast as possible. And you'd want to support them, you'd want to be seen to be encouraging them. And it's getting that balance right between giving them the freedom to perform, but also measuring them very tightly and managing them very tightly to get that performance accelerated as quickly as possible.
I think when we talk about measuring managers and what we're measuring managers on, and I think this is where lots of companies have that sort of issue. If we look at the traditional manager, you're either measured on your own performance and then partially on your team performance, or you're measured completely on your team performance. And I think we have to make a decision on where you actually manage the manager. And I think if you're managing team leading, you are leading a team, and therefore you should be measured on that team performance. But within that team performance, then you should be then measured on the individual performance and how many of your team are performing above the average within the business. And that's the bit when you start to see what good managers are. So we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. We talked about what's the one thing you'd measure your business on. And we all said we'd measure our business on retention. And so again, when I'm starting to look at managers, I'm starting to think the thing I'd measure my managers on is the retention of their staff and the development of their staff. So how many staff have got through promotion criteria? How many staff are pushing for the next promotion? Where are they on above the average billing rate, etc.? How are you retraining your staff, etc.? All of these things are things that I would start to manage the manager on and measure them on, rather than just a simple KPI of either a budget, etc. There's a lot more that goes into it that makes the budget than just simple hitting a figure. And I think that's where the stats bore out that if you're masking your performance because I'm a great salesperson and I'm great at selling and therefore I can mask my team's performance, it doesn't say anything about the team. And when we put someone into management position. It's about growing the business and about growing the team. So here's the question: then, if you know,
sorry to interrupt you, but just one last point on this, and I think we alluded to it, but it's just an important point. I think one of the things you absolutely have to measure people on are the behaviours and values that the company hold dear, and you need to be seeing those behaviours and values exhibited by the leader, by the manager, and you need to see those behaviours and values reflected in the people that work with that individual. And I think we didn't say it that succinctly. I want to make that point because you don't want rogue managers, rogue attitudes, rogue behaviours occurring in your business. So it's absolutely vital that whoever leads a team reflects the sort of integrity of the business, reflects the morality of the business. I think those things are extremely important. They need to be reflected in the behaviours of the people that work for that individual.
So if the manager's failing, then what would you say are the first steps that you would take to try help that manager or correct the situation so it doesn't become a problem?
Well, I think Dave made it. Sorry, go on, you first, Dave.
I was going to say, I think the first thing, Howard, is to get the manager to recognise that perhaps they are failing. Because often I've been in situations where I've looked at the performance or I've looked at the values that the manager is expressing, to Paul's last point, and I've seen a disconnect. But they haven't. They think they're doing okay. And so I think the first step is to get alignment so that you and your manager agree that these are the points that need to be addressed. And sometimes that can be a real issue for us as leaders because the manager doesn't agree. I can look at a performance data and say, look, you're 80% of target, you're not doing as well as you could, but all other areas are fine. So the manager isn't agreeing with me. And it's to understand where they're coming from, why they think they are where they are, and then get alignment. So that as you leave that meeting or a series of meetings, however you manage your managers, that you're both agreed that actually these are the next steps we're going to take. And that first point of alignment is so important because otherwise you're doing something that either they don't believe in or they don't recognise it needs to be done.
I mean, I agree with Dave completely. I think one of the things we've got to do if we establish that somebody isn't quite performing the way we would like them to is to understand why. Because there may be reasons perhaps that are to do with their personal lives. It's possible, something affecting them. I mean, we need to be as owners, leaders, very close to our leaders, our managers, and understand what's going on with them. There needs to be that level of, so I hesitate to use the word, but intimacy. We need to understand what's really going on with them. And I think it's very normal at the moment. I see it everywhere. People are very overwhelmed right now with the volume of work that they have to do, the amount of jobs that they have to try to cover off, the amount of demands from clients who are desperate to find staff, the demands of their own people where maybe they're not performing as well as they might do, and so on and so on. They're under a lot of pressure. Managers are under tremendous pressure at the moment. You could say that was ever thus, and the pressures over the years change in direction a little bit. People are always, to a large extent, under pressure, dealing with stress. That's the nature of what we do. Most people are very good at managing that, but sometimes people feel very overwhelmed. So I think it's a question of trying to understand why it is that somebody that you've promoted to a very important role, to supervise, to help facilitate, nurture people, is now not performing at the level that you would have anticipated. What's going on? Why is this happening? And I think it's important to be close enough to an individual to be able to interject, to get involved with that person very early on, so that whatever the issue or issues are, you're close enough to try to deal with it before it becomes a major problem.
So I think there's a couple of points there that you brought up, Paul, which I think are really important. You talked about the number of roles that this person's taking on. And this is where I start to look at managers. And I started to look at managers when I was managing managers and start to think about what they wanted. And my first thought was, these managers are doing multifaceted roles. They've got to be good at what they do, i.e. they've got to be good at what they're billing. When you then bring them into a management team, they've got to be able to work with that management team and deliver from that for that management team and be part of that cog. So there's two roles that instantly we're doing. We're then expecting them to go away and lead their team and manage their team to actually deliver the sales targets that we want. And back to your first point, we're then expecting them as leaders to be giving the vision and the values of the business and demonstrating that back to the team. So to me, there's four facets then of the management's role that we've got to conquer to enable them to actually move forward in their job, even before we start thinking about what their performance looks like. So what you said there about promoting the right people into the job is really important. And again, we'll probably talk about that a little bit later on. But what we're talking about, when managers start to fail, I start to think about, where are they failing? Are they failing on their own performance? Are they failing because they're not working as part of the management team? Are they failing on their management performance where it's about the team? Are they failing on that leadership performance, giving the vision of the values of the business? And that filters all the way back into the business from there. And I think managers have that really hard job. And when you first step up into being a manager, you probably don't understand there are four facets that you have to go through to really become a really top manager. And you have to be good at all parts of those facets to actually be able to manage your performance and other people's performance as well. And I think that's the first thing that they've got to understand, is that it's managing their own performance as a manager and other people's performance as a biller that we've got to move forward. So how do you help your manager then to deliver better performance if we're recognizing that they're failing? We've taken the first steps of talking to them, etc., etc. But how do you genuinely help your manager deliver a better performance?
I mean, my view really is, I think as the manager's manager, if that's the expression, it's your job to keep a clear and calm head. Sometimes it's as genuinely as simple as trying to clear the clouds when you sit down with somebody who is feeling overwhelmed, or is just, I don't like the word failing, or is perhaps finding, the situation a bit challenging. Let's be clear. We've promoted somebody into a role, so we must have faith in that individual. If we didn't have faith in them, if we didn't believe in them as an individual, why on earth did we give them the job in the first place? One would assume reasonably that the majority of people that we promote, or indeed we take on from outside and bring in, we have faith in. I mean, occasionally we get it wrong, that can happen, but by and large, these people that have developed into these management roles have deserved that opportunity. We've recognized their talent in the past, so they don't suddenly become underperforming. Something's going wrong. And I think particularly in these extremely challenging times that we live in, and a great times for recruitment businesses right now, but it is extremely busy. If it was me, I would want to sit down and just ask the right questions, using the skills we've all learned over the years, all those lovely open-ended questions, to try to understand what it is that's fogging up that individual's mind, why they're finding life challenging at the moment. Try to understand it, and then I think try to bring down the amount of potential issues down to a few fine points. In other words, concentrate on the 20 to 30% of the opportunities that are going to make the difference. I think it's a bit, I always use this analogy, it's probably the worst analogy you'll hear, but I always feel like it's not a question of putting a brand new engine under the bonnet of a car. The engine hasn't blown up. It's more a question of opening the bonnet and then, tightening this and loosening that, and all of a sudden the engine is running perfectly well again. Go back to basics, understand, looking at all of the elements of the role, which tiny areas need just a bit of adjustment, and then all of a sudden things start to work okay again. So it isn't the case that you've suddenly, in most cases, got on your hands a terrible manager. It's more the case that you need to identify in which specific areas, not normally that many, do a few adjustments need to be made in order to bring performance back to a level that is acceptable and indeed even high performing.
Yeah.
Dave?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I'm going to expand Paul's analogy because to me, it's a bit like having a car. And when you've all made that mistake, maybe you two haven't made that mistake because you're much more clever than I am. But when you put the wrong fuel in your car.
I've done that.
Yeah, we've all done that. And often that's what it's like when you've got a manager that isn't performing as well as they can be. Actually, the shell is exactly the same. you know that they have the ability to get you from A to B because you've promoted them into that way, but just something has gone wrong and it suddenly stopped them performing as well. And often it comes down to, in my experience, to two things: priorities and people.
Yeah.
And priorities, good managers want to do as well as they can. And when you sometimes strip it back, they're doing 50 things really quite well, when actually you want them to do 5 things really, really well. So your job as their leader is to take off their plate the things that are absolutely not priority and sharpen up that focus on the priorities. And then the second thing is people. Give the manager the opportunity to have feedback from his or her people. Because whilst they will listen to us as managers, as owners, as leaders of the business, and often we've been there and we've made mistakes and we would know better perhaps in many cases, their people who they manage know really well what it's like to be managed by them. So use the opportunity for feedback and get the manager comfortable that their people that work for them are going to give them feedback. And often in that, you can help your managers deliver better performance, in my experience.
It's the same thing. I thought of the easiest and obnoxious answer of training is the obvious answer. But obviously, if we're at that point, then and they're failing, then training's maybe a little bit too late. Although it does need to happen, we should have been training a lot further down the line. But I think what you're saying is that we need to understand the pressure points that the manager's going under, and what are the most important pressure points that we need to relieve to enable I suppose management and performance to actually start to flow again. So to me it's going back over those 4 roles or those processes and looking at how we can help them achieve more. And yes, training is going to help, but to me it's then that hands-on coaching, mentoring, using your experience as a manager, because you'll have probably gone through similar sort of things, and helping them see the light. And I think sometimes what managers fail to see when they start to move into management is their perception of their self sometimes is very different to the perception of other people. And it's them having to understand that it's not their perception of their performance that counts, it's the perception of their team's performance and the other people around them that counts. Yeah. And that to me is when you start to becoming a really good manager, when you understand that it's not your perception that counts for your performance, it's however the other people work. And we talk about, I talk in the training sessions that I do on management about the ripple effect of a manager walking into the room and it sends a ripple across the room. Is it a positive ripple? Is it a negative ripple? Is it a destructive ripple? What type of ripple is it?
Could be a raspberry ripple.
It could be for you, Paul. But what we're saying on that sort of front is the bigger ripple, though, happens when they leave the room. Because obviously when they close the door, it creates another ripple. Does that ripple be, thank God they've gone? Or is it, God, we need to keep working, it's been really motivated us to work, etc., etc. So there's the 2 types of ripple all the time. And I think that's what we need to start to be helping our managers on. And that's that sort of bit about working as a team of managers, working as a good leader of your business and driving it forward and helping people to see that. So in your experience, where in the process do you find that managers fail the most?
Okay, so I really have a dual sort of answer to this, and that is that I think in some instances it's not being, and you've just alluded to this point actually, Howard, in some instances it's not being close enough to their people. And I do think, especially, and this is the second part of the answer, where an individual is still billing and has a lot of pressure to produce high income for themselves and for the business, it's, I'm not saying it's understandable, but you can see why it becomes difficult for people to be close enough to their team members and still focused on their own desk. I mean, there's a lot going on. I think where people are non-billing managers, I think there's probably less excuses in that sense. Where people tend to go wrong, and you've alluded to this point, is not being close enough to the people. They're not motivating their people sufficiently. They're not getting into the heads, the minds, the hearts of their people. The old cliche, managers have staff, leaders have followers, is a cliche, but it's true. And where people sometimes fail is that they don't become leaders. Managers are people that get tasks done. They get jobs done. Leaders go way beyond that. And I think where people fall down is very often that they're simply not close enough to their people in order to get them to be the kind of followers, if that's the expression, that we all need when we're managing and leading staff. It's about getting close to people, people by people. It's the other adage that we all know is that people join businesses and leave bosses. It's a fact. And, the truth is that if people fall down in this area, it's simply that they're not winning over the emotions of the individuals that work for them.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, what Paul's saying, I think often when a manager is promoted into that role, often the expectations aren't set. It's almost like you've done really well in this role. It's now time for you to step up into management. And that's great. I mean, that's happened to me. It's probably happened to all of us. But then you suddenly realize you're a bit more on your own. And your company has assumed that because you're now a manager, you've taken on that big step and you're ready for it. And sometimes that isn't the case. So in the process where I find it slips up most, it's right at the very beginning when the expectations aren't set. So now I'm a manager. What do you expect of me? How do you expect me to behave? What are the values of the company? What's the purpose of the company? How are you going to measure me? And it's a really important question to ask of anybody, is how do you perform best? In what ways are you led? In what ways can I lead you to get the best performance out of you? That's why when you look at a football analogy, for example, I much prefer the title head coach to manager, because head coach implies that you're going to make the players better. And you're going to coach them, and you're going to be on the field, and you're going to be doing the drills. Whereas manager implies you may be sitting somewhere removed and telling them what to do. Now, clearly that isn't the case, because there have been some brilliant managers and there are some brilliant coaches. But just as a preference, to use that sporting analogy, I prefer coach. And it's about setting that expectation at the very beginning and then managing that.
It's interesting, isn't it? That I've got a blended answer to that from what you're saying. I think we fail right at the beginning. We tend to promote the wrong people. We don't train them. We set them up for failure. We don't set their new expectations. We don't accept what's accepted for them, etc. And I think when we start to think about that, our promotional ladder in the UK has probably created a monster that we don't really want, that everyone sees that their growth is to get to a manager, whether they've got management skills or not, because that's the next one up the chain. That's the next line to be a manager, to be a boss, etc., etc. So going from that senior salesperson to team leader, team manager just seems that natural progression, when really, if we've got a genuine progression plan written out for people that want to go up the management scale, want to go up to the sales scale, and they can see there's 2 routes or 3 routes to get to the top of where they want to be, that's based on their strengths and not based on just their capabilities of generating cash, then we start to see a very different performance and a very different type of person. Because what we're talking about is most people in sales have this ego, and we're fanning their ego saying manager's the best position, it's the next best position, get to manager, when they might not be a person who's got the capabilities or the want or the drive to manager. We were on last week with Kelly, Paul, and she was promoted into a manager and hated it, didn't want to be promoted. So she didn't have a choice, because that was the next logical position for her. So we start to think the fragility of people is very important, that we have to get the right, I suppose, route for them to make their own victories is really important. But what we do is we promote them into management. And as Kelly found, she had nowhere to retreat, nowhere to step backwards without losing face. Yeah. I'm stepping back from being a manager and I'm now going to be just a salesperson again. Everyone see me as a failure, when that's a perception of a poor promotion process, that we're not promoting people into the right jobs, but nor have we got a career path for each type of person that we want within the business. And I think that's where we fail. So the managers always step into that process, and they're almost destined for failure at certain points, because we haven't started to allow to understand what that's going to be, because we haven't created that in the first place. So to me, that's where we start to have that failing process, which then leads to that question, doesn't it? And I know we're going to cover this massively next week, but the question is, big biller versus biller with management potential. Who do you coach? Who do you promote? Who do you develop?
I mean, it's a really tough question because, in a sense, there's no reason why we would divide a big biller versus a biller with management potential, because big billers can make brilliant managers. There's no reason why they shouldn't. I think that the deeper question is, what is it that people want in their careers? You talked about ladders a moment ago, and obviously with a name like Jacobs, I'm an expert on ladders, as you'll be well aware. So I think that it's understanding what people want in their lives. If they want to make an awful lot of money for the business, for themselves, and they have limited desire or no desire to manage people, as we heard last week, Howard, you're absolutely right. There is no point in pushing a square peg into a round hole. I mean, you're only going to end up in a situation where that individual becomes disillusioned, disheartened, upset, and ultimately leaves the business, and you've lost yourself a great member of staff who was making lots of money for the company and for themselves, and they've gone somewhere else to do it for somebody else or for themselves. It makes no sense to push people that have limited desire or even ability to do it. And sometimes we tend to sort of link that with big billers. It's not always the case. I've had some outstanding big billers who were brilliant managers too. I think the question is really much more about, what is it that people want to achieve in their careers? Do they have a great desire to become a teacher? Because I'm going to say that word very deliberately, because I think to be a great leader, a great manager, you have to have a desire to teach people. And it isn't about doing it because there's something in it for you, which is often the trait of the big billers. You know, that sort of, I mean, I hate to say it, and I'm sure there'll be some people smiling listening to this, but often big billers tend to have a selfish attitude. It's all about what they want and how much money they're going to make and so forth. They can be avaricious and all those things, when what we want in leaders is a selfless attitude, an attitude that says, I'm going to put time and energy into you as the person that's working with me, because you know what, that's what I want to do. I get pleasure out of nurturing and developing people. There are lots of attributes you look for in leaders and managers. And I think it's understanding what it is that somebody has that would lead them to become a great leader in due course. And that, also to your point, Howard, is making sure that when you promote them, you're giving them a great opportunity to succeed, not to fail. So making sure they're coached in advance of being promoted is vital, I think. So it's hard to differentiate. I don't think we can, in my opinion, big biller v biller. I think it comes down to understanding what it is people want in their careers and what personal attributes they exhibit. What is it that they can bring to the table as a potential great leader?
Dave?
Yeah, I like. I'm just looking up the word avaricious to make sure that it isn't to do with avian flu or something like that. So I know what it is. I think for me, you sit down with those two individuals, those two groups of people, the big billers and the ones with management potential. And the answer to the question for me, Howard, is you coach both, you develop both, and then you promote the one that wants to follow his or her career in the management and leadership. I managed one of the very, very best big billers I've ever had when I was at the JN Group. And that person was very, very clear with me, please don't make me a manager. Please don't give me that responsibility. Please don't give me that direction. And also what she was saying is, and please don't lessen my earnings, because I know I can earn really well in this role, and that's what I want. And once we've established that, it was very easy to continue to coach and develop that person and make them even better at what they did. Their sales continued, that was great. But then there were more junior people who we developed as managers. And one of that person's resources ended up, in the time I was there, becoming that person's boss. And the big biller didn't bother that person at all. They were doing really, really well, and they were earning really, really well. And the manager had developed their career into management, and now he's in another company, and he's leading, doesn't have an individual target, but is actually leading another business absolutely brilliantly. And that potential was spotted early, not by me, by somebody who worked with me, and we worked on that potential and developed it. So it's all about understanding what it is that the individual wants. If that's aligned to what the business needs, then you've got the perfect match. And I would promote people as quickly as you can, because if people are wanting to be promoted and your business can afford to promote them and we can develop them, then let's get leaders in our business at all ages. And certainly don't make age a barrier, because there's some great people out there with potential who aren't even 25 yet.
So it's interesting. I can say it's interesting what we're... Go on, Dave, sorry.
I was just saying there are some big billers out there who have been doing it for 20 years and haven't got management potential, and nor do they want it.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we were saying, last year about we hire on skills and we tend to fire on behaviours. Here is the point where behaviours is absolutely the right thing to be looking at. The right behaviours of the person, irrespective of whether you're a big biller or a biller. What behaviours do you have? Do you have the behaviours that allow you to coach, develop, and promote other people within the business? Or do you have the behaviours that you are a selfish biller? And I say that in the most nicest way, because most big billers are reasonably selfish people, but it's how you develop those people. So it's find the right people, and you're square peg round hole type scenario. But to me, it's all about measuring behaviors of what you want from your managers, measuring behaviors what you want from your big billers, and you'll find there are two separate behavior chains, and therefore you can push your person down that right one. So one of the things we talked about before is one of the measures that we've suggested was to measure managers on attrition. Why do we think then that is so important when we start to talk about the difference between good managers and poor performing managers? Why do we think that attrition is such a relative measure for people's performance?
Well, I used the cliche earlier that people join companies and leave bosses, and clearly, if you have an individual who is managing people who is consistently losing them, there is an issue. And what you don't want, especially at this point in time when it's incredibly difficult to find good quality people, is create a proverbial turnstile in your business where people are coming and going. I mean, the expense. I'm not just talking here about the actual expense of empty desks or maybe rec-to-rec fees or advertising fees. The expense to the business is enormous. It's enormous from the perspective of the impact on morale, the fact that clearly a desk that isn't performing, is empty for a period of time, is costing the business an awful lot of lost income and so on and so forth. Attrition is it's not a great measurement. It's certainly a measurement that we've got to keep an eye on. You could reverse it and also talk in terms of measurement from a positive perspective of retention. How long are people staying in a business working for certain individuals? And I know, and you guys do as well, I work with businesses that have had staff working for them for years, in 10, 15, 20 years. And it speaks volumes for the culture of the organizations, speaks volumes for the leadership skills of the people that manage those businesses, that they've had such loyalty from people for such a lengthy period of time. So clearly, if the opposite is occurring and people are unable to keep people working for them for any period of time, and there is this constant revolving door, boy, do you have an issue. And that really reverts back to the earlier point we were making about being close enough to staff, being caring enough about them to take a genuine interest in them as a human being, supporting them through the bad times as well as the good times, wanting to train and develop them, feeling that you want to be a mentor or a coach. All of the things we discussed, all of those things need to be in play, and where they're not, then you've got an issue.
I think attrition is so important, and there's positive attrition as well, because you can manage people and get them promoted and they leave your team because they go on to open a new division, a new geography, whatever it is. But I'll use that sporting analogy again. There's that line where people say, "Oh, the manager has lost the dressing room." It doesn't matter what the sport is, but the players aren't playing for the manager, and that's when people leave. And your job as the overall leader or as that manager's leader is to make sure that your managers aren't losing the dressing room. That could be a team of 2 or 3. It could be a whole office of 15 or 16, or it could be a whole territory. There could be a sales director, so a sales manager looking after a number of different offices. And your job as a leader is to understand why it is that people who are working for that person aren't working as well as they could be. So I think you should measure on attrition. The problem with measuring on attrition, of course, is that it takes a long time. And go back to my earlier point, Howard, of saying actually, if managers aren't performing as well as you want them to do, you need to be managing them much, much more regularly, 48 hours, 4 days a week, whatever that is. Whereas attrition, of course, takes a long time. So you've got to get that balance right before they start to leave, before people start to leave.
So I think attrition to me is that really important thing. I remember inheriting an office at CP, and they were saying this person who's managing the office, it's our best office, it's our best manager, etc., etc. And when I started to sort of do a bit of analysis on the office before taking it over, her attrition was absolutely woeful. But she was a brilliant salesperson, and she was hitting most of the target by herself. And it was only when I started to go in and have a long conversation with her to talk about her attrition, and that's her major problem, we discovered that really she didn't want to manage. And so we maneuvered a position for her where she had brought other people into the business to manage the business. And we created the biggest billing and the biggest growth office in the division, very, very quickly, where it was a high performing office, and everyone thought she was a high performing manager when she wasn't. She was a high performing salesperson managing people poorly because the attrition was that there. But because they never measured attrition, they only measured performance by a number of a figure on a P&L. It masked all of that. But once we started to remove that, it changed. So I think attrition is absolutely the right thing. So you alluded something there, Dave, which I want to come to you first on. Why do you think that it's important to address a failing manager quickly, or quicker than you would do normally a consultant?
Because they are the leaders in the business, and you want your leaders performing well because people look up to them. People want to be inspired by them. People want to follow those people. So if they're not doing very well, it stands out like a sore thumb. Sometimes in smaller companies and in larger companies, if you're a consultant, you can hide a little bit more because you're less visible, or because you've got your manager protecting you. But if you're one of the managers, and remember that most of the companies that are in recruitment have got less than 10 people. So that probably means they've got 2 managers. Well, if one of your managers isn't performing as well, that's 50% of your leadership team. So therefore, you can't afford to let that slip by a week, by a month, by 6 months, whatever it is in measurement. So I think it really is very important to attach onto that. And to Paul's point earlier, because he made it really well, I don't like that term failing managers, because the implication is that it's entirely the manager's fault that they're failing. And I have never, ever in my career been in this situation where I've had a manager that is failing, that's worked for me, where some of it hasn't been my fault. It's never, ever entirely the manager's fault. There's always some other reason. Some of it could be outside of work, but often it's how they're led.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So you look at yourself and go, I could lead this person better and they will perform better.
Yeah.
So it's not entirely the manager's fault.
Yeah, you're completely right. And I think that's your question, Howard. If you think of it in terms of engineering, if you look at it from an engineering perspective, to your point, if you've got if I'm no engineer, but if you've got a pillar holding up a structure and that pillar is weak, the structure collapses, doesn't it? So, getting into a manager who is supporting a range of people, and I use that analogy deliberately because I always think that great managers support their people. It isn't, and I don't like the language when people talk about people working for them. I don't like that language. My attitude when I was managing a lot of people was, I said to my regional directors, area managers, we work for them. It's our job to serve them. So to do everything we can to support them, to help them, to perform well, to love their jobs, to love the business they work in and enjoy work and love coming to work every day. We serve them. So if you think of it in engineering terms, if that pillar is weak, the whole structure collapses. That's why it's so important to address, again, to Dave's point, don't like the word failing, but to address a manager who is struggling, because if you don't get in there early, then you suddenly find it's not just one person you have an issue with, you are losing an awful lot of people.
And I think it's the same thing. I think you've got to address it early, because they are the most influential people within your business, and then they're usually the most people who are close to the sales line, and therefore they're influencing the sales line. And how we can then change the influence on that sales line is really important. So addressing it quickly is absolutely paramount. Where a lot of companies, when I go into, what I find it is the management structure that's the weakest part of the business, to your analogy, Paul, and therefore they're letting the rest of the business down. It's falling and crumbling around them, but no one's doing anything to shore that management structure up, and they're blaming the staff, and the staff are blaming them. And you've got to get rid of that type of blame culture and start to build a strong management culture. And it's all about the strong management culture, then it creates a stronger culture underneath. So the more you address it, the quicker it is. So the last question, and very quick answer on this, because we're sort of running out of time. Is it possible to retain a manager if they are performing poorly? Let's take the word failing out. Performing poorly as a manager, but excel at sales?
Absolutely is the answer. And it's your earlier point, getting in early. So if it is the case that for whatever reason, we've got somebody that's now managing people that is clearly not enjoying the job, and people are not enjoying working for them, and after a great deal of coaching and discussion, the conclusion is that they are better off working in a sales environment, then absolutely, let's make that happen. Give the people that are brilliant salespeople that don't enjoy managing or don't want to manage people every opportunity to stay in your business. Give them great job titles, give them brilliant bonus opportunities, pay them well, take care, love them, and all the rest of those things. But give them a job they'll excel in and that they love doing. Don't continue to force them to do something that isn't working for them or for the business.
Dave?
Yeah, if you've got great salespeople, keep them. If they're poor managers, but the great salespeople, put them into sales roles. Call them what you like. They can still be managers. The managers don't have to manage people. If the title's important to them and they're a manager and they want to retain a manager, but actually they're not very good at management, but they're really good at sales, keep the management title and just keep them. You should be keeping all your good salespeople. Anybody that can perform well, keep them.
I think it's my comment was about earlier on, wasn't it, about that progression ladder and the ego of the person, and therefore you have to give them a route backwards that doesn't look like it's a backward step or it looks like they've failed at something. You've got to give them that saving face opportunity to move forward in a positive manner. And I think if you can do that, then you can certainly excel and keep those salespeople, because as we found out last week, we had a 400K biller last week who was walking out of the company because of being forced into management, and there was no backward step for her, and she felt there was no backward step at all. So we think we've got to look at that. Next week, we're going to finish our last one on management, and next week we're going to hit that very thorny subject of billing manager versus non-billing manager, and all of those things that go with that and how that looks. So feel free to join us next week, same time, 11 o'clock.
Thank you, everybody.
Dave and Paul, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow when we're down in Birmingham together, Paul and Dave.
Yep.
Everyone else, enjoy the rest of the sunshine. I hope it stays hot and dry wherever you are. And once again, thanks so much. See you all next week.
See you, everybody. Take care.
Have a good week.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe. Bye, everyone.
Bye.